Now, our first speaker this morning is Professor Bob White, who is now the director of the Faraday Institute, and along with Dennis Alexander, who founded Faraday, Bob's vision to have something like this was instrumental in bringing it into being. He's actually Professor of Geophysics at the University of Cambridge and a Fellow of the Royal Society. He's also a Fellow of St Edmund's College, where Faraday has its home. His research focus is on sort of such mega events such as volcanic eruptions and earthquakes, climate change, and such like. He's written numerous scientific publications in that area, but he's also written about climate change in the context of Christian discipleship, co-author of Christianity, Climate Change and Sustainable Living, which you'll find on the bookstall, and editor of Creation in Crisis, Christian Perspectives on Sustainability. And he's doing quite a lot of research work on the moment on natural disasters, acts of God, or human folly, which is not the topic he's speaking on today, but is something that he's going to be writing on and speaking on in the future. So Bob, hand over to you. Take 10, the religious views of famous scientists.
Thanks, Hilary. I feel a bit of a fraud. This is a bit like the taster before a meal, you know, when you have a few little things to get your juices going, because John is going to give the real talk this afternoon on historical interactions between science and faith. But I thought I'd just share with you something that came about by accident. As Hilary said, I'm a Fellow of the Royal Society, and a few years ago they had their 350th anniversary, and as part of that, some grand committee of the Royal Society sat down and thought, well, we'll find one scientist from each 35 years, so we get 10 scientists, and we'll put them on stamps. Well, of course, they're first-class stamps, of course. They didn't have any second-class stamps. So here's 10 scientists chosen for their impact on the world globally by this committee, with no thought, of course, of their religious views or anything. This was their scientific impact. Well, it turned out that I had to give a talk at my church a year or so ago, and our daughter had been very ill, and I'd been rather distracted by that, going off to Oxford, and actually I hadn't prepared it, and the night before I was wondering, what on earth am I going to talk about? And I saw this first day cover sitting on my desk, and I looked at it and I thought, I know he was a really devout Christian, and that guy was a Christian. So I started looking at them, and it was quite interesting to see these pioneers of science, how much their faith was an integral part of their life, and how much, as I looked into it, in some cases certainly it had affected the way they thought about their science. That's certainly true of Newton, but maybe of others as well. So what I thought I'd do is just a sort of gentle introduction on a Saturday morning, is just talk through these 10 and see, just share with you something about their views on faith. And of course it's pretty relevant to do so in our current climate, because there are people with very loud voices saying that religious beliefs are irrational. In fact, this is something Richard Dawkins has got on his website. Religious beliefs are dumb and dumber, super dumb. So just in case you're dumb enough not to get the message, he's said it 3 times. And just recently I reviewed this book by Peter Atkins. All actions, be they physical or cerebral, are purposeless, he said. And at the end of the book, this is amazing, really. The thing he writes at the end of the book, I could hardly believe this, but I was very polite in my review. He said, "This is a sound and firm foundation for the joy of true comprehension. Once you realise that everything is meaningless, then you get the joy of true comprehension." So, well, that's certainly not my experience, but it's what his view is. And so I thought I'd dig into that. Is that the case with these scientists that have really influenced society globally over the past 350 years? Let me just say something about the Royal Society first. It was founded in 1660, and their motto is nullius in verba, which is almost impossible to translate. Typical, isn't it, really? But actually, when you dig into it, it means something like this. It means something like, take no one's word for it. In other words, the Royal Society, when it was set up, was specifically set up by men, and it was all men in those days, to investigate the world around them as they found it, and to see how it worked, to understand it, actually for the good of humankind, as we'll see. That was their explicit aim. Rather than just looking back to what famous people before them and before them and before them had said, and just repeating that time after time, which was sort of the Greek way in a way. So rather than actually just take somebody else's word for it, get stuck in, see how things work. And of course that is still the motto of science today. And if you want to make yourself name as a really well-known scientist, the thing to do is to disprove evolution or something. Don't take anybody's word for it. Dig in. If you find a theory that explains everything we know now, plus some things that don't quite fit, you'll make your name. And of course, one of the characteristics of this sort of science is that scientists are always very sceptical about things. And if you've ever sat in a scientific forum, a discussion, a colloquium or something, you'll realise that. And it sort of makes me laugh, really, when people talk about scientists have got a conspiracy about global warming or whatever it is, or about evolution, have this conspiracy to work together, because you know full well that if just one of them can prove all the others wrong, he's going to be famous. And he's going to really work at it. And the key to doing science is to be sceptical about things, because the big meta-theories of science, whatever they are, don't work in every single context. There's always things that don't quite fit, but the main theory is so good that you say, well, that's okay, I'll go with that. And you work away at the bits that don't fit. That's what scientists do. They work at the things that don't fit, not the things that do. And that's the way you make advances now and then. There's, of course, lots of blind alleys on the way. And you can see through the history of science that this is the case. Because, for instance, I'll talk about Newton in a minute. He's one of these 10. Newton's theories of the motion of things, which explain how the planets go around the sun, and how you play billiards, it controls how the billiard balls move. Newton's laws of motion are good enough to get a man to the moon, as indeed they did, and back again. But they're not good enough if you're trying to go at the speed of light, or close to the speed of light. Then you need something more. You need Einstein's theories. But Newton's laws are perfectly good. But interestingly, although they explain the world pretty well, unless you're at those very high speeds, they're actually founded on completely incorrect premises. His premise was that things go in a straight line unless something happens to them. Well, we know now that space-time is curved, and that is not the case. So it was actually founded on something wrong. It gave useful results, and it still does give useful results. But when Einstein came along, he can replicate everything that Newton could explain, plus more besides. And one day something will come along which will explain Einstein's theories, and more besides. The grand unified theory of everything, or whatever. So Richard Feynman, one of the greatest physicists of the 20th century, said exactly that. Science is organised scepticism in the reliability of expert opinion. And some of you might remember that shuttle disaster that blew up. He very elegantly proved, he's a brilliant physicist, and he just proved before the Senate hearing that it was a little O-ring seal that had failed, because it had been unseasonably cold weather like this before the launch, and this little O-ring seal had gone brittle. When it launched, it cracked, and fuel came out through the joint and ignited. And he showed it really elegantly. He was just sitting at a table like this. He put a glass of water, and of course, being American, it was iced water, unlike England. And he dipped the O-ring in it for a couple of minutes, put it on the table, tapped it, and it cracked. And I mean, that is brilliant. A brilliant exposition of what's going on, and I think it's a mark of a brilliant mind to do that. Something very obvious that everyone says, yeah, of course that's obvious, but nobody has seen it. So science is organised scepticism, and if you look at the Royal Society Charter from 1663, when King Charles set it up, this is what he wrote in the preamble, that one of his reasons for giving a charter was so that he would always be recognised not only as the defender of the faith, but also as a universal lover and patron of every kind of truth. Now, that's that linkage that John Polkinghorne was talking about last night, that all truth is God's truth. So, truth points to faith as well as pointing to material understanding of the world. So that was right there in 1663. he went on to say exactly this, which I think a lot of scientists today will be surprised about actually, that the Royal Society's studies are to be applied to further promoting by the authority of experiments the sciences of natural things, that's science as we know it, and of useful arts, to the glory of God the Creator and the advantage of the human race. So it had this dual purpose, that actually looking at God's world would give glory to God the Creator, and actually it was a useful thing to do, which of course we know it is. We've eradicated smallpox from the world, which used to kill millions of people. We're almost in sight of eradicating leprosy, and we all live longer, and all kinds of things. And they saw that very clearly, that dual purpose, right at the beginning in the founding of it. And this sort of view that it's worth looking at the world in two ways is something, again, that John talked about last night. He talked about the richness of looking at the world through the binocular vision of the eye of faith and the eye of science. But actually looking at it with either on its own gives you a very one-dimensional view, but seeing both you can see the depth of the world. That's not actually a new idea. In the 2nd century, Tertullian said, "Reason is the property of God, since there is nothing which God, the creator of all things, has not foreseen, arranged, and determined by reason. Moreover, there's nothing he doesn't wish to be investigated and understood by reason." In other words, there's absolutely no excuse for not trying to examine things in the world and see how they work. And Tertullian saw that really clearly a long time ago. And Augustine, a bit later, picked up the same idea: nature is what God does. And so it's a very careless sort of thing to say, "Oh, that's just natural process, so God wasn't in that." As Augustine said clearly, if God created this world, if that is the case, then the way this world works is part of the way God works. Nature is what God does. I think that's quite a helpful little aphorism, actually, because we're sometimes tempted to split this world into things we understand which have nothing to do with God and things we don't, which that's where God is. And as John said yesterday, that's the sort of God of the gaps idea. If you have this much bigger view of the world, nature is what God does. And so Francis Bacon is the person, I suppose, that he picked up these ideas in the 16th century. And his views were around at the time the Royal Society was set up. God must first be known from nature, he said, and afterwards recognised from doctrine, by which, he went on to say, from nature by his works, that's doing science, and from doctrine by his revealed words, that's scripture, reading the Bible. That you need these two ways of looking at the world to get a richer view of the world. Actually, I love this picture of Bacon here. It's intrinsic. It's just so exhausted by thinking about it. That statue is just down the road. If you have a bit of time, you can wander in. It's in the lobby of the chapel there. So science and scripture, these two eyes of looking at the world. And interestingly, a lot of people hold Darwin up as a great arch point at which atheism became possible. Which is complete nonsense, really, because if you look in the very first edition of The Origin of Species, on the flyleaf here, which you won't be able to read, he had a quotation from Francis Bacon. It was this, the quotation he put on that flyleaf was, "Let no man think or maintain that a man can search too far or be too well studied in the book of God's Word, the Bible, or in the book of God's works, that's science. But rather let men endeavour at endless progress or proficiency in both," said Bacon. So Darwin put that right up front in this book. Now, interestingly, he didn't quote the next bit of that sentence. When you go back to Bacon's original book, that's where he stopped the quotation. If you read the very next bit of it, Bacon went on to say this. He said, "Only let men beware that they apply both to charity and not to swelling, to use and not to ostentation," which would be quite a useful thing to tell some of our scientists today who think because they're good at one particular branch of science they can then expostulate on the whole world and everything to do with the meaning of life. Okay, well let me move on. Darwin, I showed that one from Darwin simply because, interestingly, he wasn't one of the 10 people that the Royal Society chose. I think maybe they thought he'd had his day in the sun already, so they chose Wallace. It's his anniversary this year, and he was from a much lower class. He was collecting out in the Far East, and he had very similar ideas to Darwin at the same sort of time, but Darwin got the glory But we'll talk about Wallace in a minute. I want to start with Robert Boyle, who was one of the founders of the Royal Society. It was a group of men that used to meet together in Oxford, actually, before the Royal Society was set up. And then they met in Gresham College in London and decided to set up this society. He was one of that select group. And he was a very devout Christian. He wasn't just a cultural Christian. You might think, well, at the time everybody was Christian, which there is some truth in that. But he was very devout to the extent that people thought he was too enthusiastic at the time. Robert Boyle set up the whole business of chemistry, actually, in universities. Chemistry was a rather smelly and dirty sort of thing to be doing at the time, and it wasn't really thought to be fit for universities to do. So actually Boyle was the person that put that on a sound footing. And some of you might have remembered Boyle's law from school that relates pressure and temperature, and some of you I know teach it still to people. Well, that was Robert Boyle. That was one of the things he did. He did lots of other things. So he wrote this book called A Skeptical Chemist, which is really thought to have put chemistry on a professional basis in the first place. But he also wrote books specifically about Christian work. And one of them was this one called The Christian Virtuoso. Now, like books of the time, it had a long subtitle which actually tells you what it's about, and this is what that particular book was about. Boyle said it was that by being addicted to experimental philosophy, that's what we call science, a man is rather assisted than indisposed to be a good Christian. He thought the two went hand in hand, and being a good scientist helps you to be a good Christian, and actually vice versa as well. Now, Robert Boyle was a very devout evangelical Christian. He was a very rich man, one of the richest men in England, and he used his fortunes to do mission work and so on all over the world, actually. He was connected with the work in India, and he used to get things sent back to him, natural things to be interested in. But he also translated the Bible into Malay. He was from Ireland, had a lot of holdings in Ireland, so he translated the Bible into Irish, or he paid for it to be done, and also into North American Indian, a long thing. And he set up mission societies in both North America and in India. So he certainly lived out his life and used his fortune for that sort of thing, as well as doing his science. And certainly some people have said that his care about his spiritual standing actually was something that led to his care in his chemistry work as well. But actually, because he approached his spiritual life so carefully and thoroughly, he also approached his scientific life with the same sort of care and exactitude and refusal to just accept facile explanations. And that may have been why he did so well at it. So certainly he was a very profound Christian, as indeed were many of the founders of the Royal Society. As I said, who set it up with the express purpose of using understanding of the world for the good of humankind. So that was the first 35 years. Next one was Isaac Newton, and of course we've all heard of Isaac Newton. He was a pretty difficult man, actually, but he obviously was extremely insightful as well. What I think people don't realise is that he spent more time and he wrote more words on religion than he did on science. Everybody thinks of him as a scientist, which of course he was. But he wrote 2.5 million words, out of something like 4 million words, on religion. Now, he was a pretty sort of strange, off-beam religious views, in fact, for the time. Amongst other things, he was a Unitarian, which he got out of the Bible, from his reading of the Bible. Which is quite funny, really, because he was a fellow of Trinity College in Cambridge. And it was actually not a very good idea to be a Unitarian. It was, I mean, in theory you could get executed for it, but you could certainly get kicked out of things. So he kept that rather quiet during his lifetime. But what he did, of course, was scientifically, the big thing he wrote was the Principia, which set science or physics on a sound basis and set off the laws of motion and so on, which we still use today, particularly the law of gravity. But if you look at his his book again. Look at the first edition of that, Principia. Oh, well, incidentally, before I talk about that, do you know how many equations there are in the Principia? Anybody know how many equations there are in Principia? There's actually no equations at all. He wrote everything out in words, which I think is why it's almost impossible for anybody to understand it. It was even uncertain whether anybody really, there's only a few people that understood it at the time. It's a bit about like Stephen Hawking's book, that apparently is the most unread book in the world. It's on so many shelves. But anyway, in his book, in Principia, he had a foreword, a preface by Roger Coates, who also lived in Cambridge, who sadly died an early death from getting flu in the terrible weather when he was 32. But he wrote this. He said, "The order of nature was established by the will of God." That's right up front in the preface of Principia. He must be blind who from the most wise and excellent contrivances of things cannot see the infinite wisdom and goodness of their almighty Creator. And he must be mad and senseless who refuses to acknowledge them. I mean, that's right there in the can you imagine a scientific textbook with such influence today, having that right at the front there? But that's what Newton did. And then later, from the second edition onwards, Newton actually added a thing a part at the end called the General Scholium, which actually looked specifically at Christian faith in the light of what he'd been doing. I'll show you some extracts from that in a minute, but before that I just want to talk about Newton's character a bit. As I said, he was quite a difficult man, but he was also a very intense man, and he was up at Cambridge quite young, as they were then. When he was 19, in 1662, he wrote this shorthand. You won't be able to read it because it's written in his own code of shorthand, but it was a list of his sins that he had committed. He was, always looking very carefully at his own life. Before Whit Sunday, 1662, you won't be able to read that either, so I'm going to blow some of them up. The 21 sins. Here's some of them. Some of them are quite funny, actually. Stealing cherry cobs from Edward's school. And then denying that I did so. Punching my sister, this might sound... Well, we laugh, don't we? But actually, there is something to looking into your life like that. So Newton did that. Actually, this is time to give a little plug. The Faraday Institute actually commissioned a play about Newton, which is founded on, quite cleverly, although you have to watch it about 3 times to understand it, founded on the 3 Newtons: the young Newton at this age, the mature Newton, and then the old age Newton. And there's 3 actors that sort of swap between these 3 people in dialogue, if you like. And we've just recently, it's just come out last week or 2, a book on that, which has a DVD of the play in the back, but also a series of essays, one of which is by John here, who we'll be talking this afternoon, about Newton, which are very readable, and I think it's really interesting. I mean, I enjoyed reading it, so that's next door there. So that was Newton. Now, in this General Scholium that he wrote at the back, he said this most elegant system of the sun, planets and comets that were explained by the law of gravity could not have arisen without the design and dominion of an intelligent and powerful being. That's what he wrote. And some people have certainly drawn attention to the fact that his sort of leap of imagination that brought about the law of gravity actually came directly from his Christian faith, his faith in a creator God. Because you see, what he did was he said, well, there's an invisible, unseen force between the sun and the earth, which is pulling them together and keeps the earth going around the sun without flying off into space. Now, that's a remarkable step. It's so commonplace to us, we don't really think about it, do we? But there's nothing between us and the sun. There isn't a piece of string. There's a vacuum. There's essentially no matter there. So why on earth should this earth keep going around the sun? It's this force which has no means of transmitting it between the sun and the earth. And that was a remarkable step, and it came about, many people think, because he had this view that God, the Creator, was in charge of everything. So if God wants to make a force to make the earth go around the sun, that's no problem for God. And indeed, that is what he did. And in fact, that's what he thought. That's what he says here, that that's what God was doing. So he was able to take this step of imagination because of that belief. Now, interestingly, he realised after a bit that actually the motions aren't perfect. They actually precess a bit. They go out of the exact motions, mainly because there are some other little planets he didn't know about. But he actually thought that God had to poke it back into the right orbit every now and then. And that wasn't a problem to him either. He was quite happy with God doing that. But it actually was the cause of a huge argument between him and Leibniz at the time, who said that a perfect God would not make something so imperfect that he had to poke it back into place. And they had a very bitter argument, actually, which is talked about in that play. So his faith certainly had a profound influence on his science, interestingly. And he was quite open about it. There was no secret about this. Well, we move on through the years. We come to Benjamin Franklin. Of course, he's well known for being part of the founding fathers of the USA. But also he invented, I don't know if you know this, the lightning rod and bifocal spectacles, which are still in use today. Very versatile man. And he had certainly a belief in God. It seems to be moving away, as many people did through this part of history, from a belief in a theistic God, a God that's really engaged with the world, to a more deistic one, a sort of mechanic God that set the world going and then left it to its own devices. Now that's really interesting. The person that told us to switch off our phones so you don't feel bad about it. Benjamin Franklin believed in God. Here's his statue. And indeed he wrote this series of almanacs under a pseudonym called Poor Richard. But people, I guess, knew it was him, they certainly do now. And he used to write some quite funny little things in them, like how many observe Christ's birthday, how few his precepts. It's easier to keep holidays and commandments, he said. Now, interestingly, when some of the discussions over the Charter of the United States that they're trying to write at the time, was stalled, it was Benjamin Franklin who said, well, we should stop now, and we should pray about it. And he actually instituted morning prayers before meetings in the USA. But later in his life, actually, and this was just a few months before he died, he wrote to his great friend, Ezra Stiles, who was president of Yale. And he wrote this: here is my creed, and he's pretty explicit about this. I believe in one God, the creator of the universe, that he governs by his providence, that he ought to be worshipped, that the most acceptable service we render to him is doing good to his other children, that the soul of man is immortal and will be treated with justice in another life, respecting its conduct in this. Now, he's very open about his belief. As I said, he wasn't completely orthodox, and it's quite interesting that he went on to write, as to Jesus of Nazareth, I think his system of morals and his religion as he left them to us, the best the world ever saw or is likely to see. Now that's something, you used to read it in obituaries, I think it's in the Times and so on. You don't see it so much now, but they used to say he was a good Christian man, she was a good Christian woman, meaning that they lived out sort of ideals of serving other people and being generous and kind and so on. Not actually that they were Christian believers, but they lived out those precepts well. And you still, I mean, a lot of my friends say, well, I'm not a Christian, I can't believe in God, but I think that the Sermon on the Mount is a great way to live. I think what Jesus said made a lot of sense, and it's a good way to live your life. And I guess that's what Benjamin Franklin was saying. But here's the bit that shows his unorthodoxy. He has some doubts as to the divinity of Jesus. It's quite funny here. He knew he was dying or near the end of his life. Though it's a question I do not dogmatise upon, having never studied it, and think it needless to busy myself with it now, when I expect soon an opportunity of knowing. So there's a row of the first three. Clearly Christians, clearly believing that God was part of what went on in the world. We come on to Edward Jenner. Do you remember what Jenner did? Yes, good. Here we are. That was a cartoon at the time. he discovered from his rural place he lived in Gloucestershire that milkmaids who'd been exposed to cowpox didn't seem to get smallpox. And so he had the idea of taking some of the cowpox and injecting it into somebody to see if it stopped them getting smallpox. And he did this amazing experiment. He took some cowpox sores from a milkmaid called Sarah Nelms, and he injected an 8-year-old boy called James Phipps. Now, can you imagine getting ethical clearance for that? Well, he just did it. And actually it worked. This cartoon, you can see people have been injected sort of growing bits of cow, funny heads and horns and things. That was, I think people were a bit worried about it at the time, with good reason, I think, actually, but it did work. Jenner was, he was actually the 8th of 9 children born to a Reverend Stephen Jenner, who was the vicar of Berkeley in Gloucestershire, very close to where I spent some of my youth. So he had that sort of background. Now, he wasn't particularly open about his faith. I mean, I think he just got on with it because that was the thing he did. But nevertheless, he wrote this: the whole creation is the work of God's hands. It cannot manage itself. Man cannot manage it. Therefore, God is the manager. That was what Jenner wrote, actually. That's what he believed. And he just regularly went to church, as people did then, I guess. And in fact, he was vice president of the Cheltenham Auxiliary Bible Society. So he was certainly somebody that was comfortable with Christian faith, although he wasn't particularly active in it in the way that Robert Boyle was really an integral part of his life. But he saw no conflict between that and his science. Well, the last one on the top row is Charles Babbage. Do you remember what Babbage did? Computers, yeah, everything we use today sort of stemmed from his insights. He built this calculating machine which never actually worked, but in his lifetime, although the principle of it would work. And this is in the Science Museum now. It was put together by his son, actually, after he died, from all the bits he found lying around. So I think it does actually work, but it wasn't in Charles Babbage's lifetime. But he held the Lucasian Chair of Maths here in Cambridge, which Newton had held before him, and which Stephen Hawking held most recently, although he's just retired. He was a devout Anglican Christian, Babbage was. And he believed, certainly believed in God in a very devout, sort of enthusiastic way, more so than the previous two I've talked about. And there was a famous series called the Bridgewater Treatise, which had been published about this time, which were pamphlets, booklets, which were seeking to show the interaction of science and faith and how Christian belief impacted science. He wasn't asked to write one, so he wrote his own and published it anyway, and he called it the Ninth Bridgewater Treatise. This is what he said in there. He said, "The study of the works of nature with scientific precision is a necessary and indispensable preparation to the understanding and interpreting their testimony of the wisdom and goodness of their divine Creator." That's a bit of a long-winded sentence, and I would have, if I'd had my red pen, I would say break it up into 3, but which I do to my students all the time. But you can see what he's saying, that actually study of scientific study is necessary and indispensable preparation to understanding God the Creator. And his whole treatise is devoted to that. So he certainly saw not just no conflict between science and religion, but he saw it as part of the proper preparation for understanding the world better, actually. So they were all pretty conventional, but interestingly, as you come through the centuries more towards the present, you see a change in that. And Alfred Russel Wallace, as I said, was the person that thought of the theory of evolution about the same time as Darwin, but didn't quite get the recognition for it. And in fact, in 1858, he wrote to Charles Darwin, where he'd been collecting specimens and sending them back to rich patrons, gentlemen scientists in Britain. And he set out a theory of natural selection, which was very similar to what Darwin had been working on for 2 decades, but Darwin was a bit slow about publishing things. And actually, in Darwin's words, he said when he read this letter from Wallace, he was smashed. Smashed was the word he used. because he might lose primacy for all these decades of work. Well, in fact, he didn't. But having taken advice, Darwin was a very honest person, and he took advice from his friend Hooker, who said, well, the thing to do is to present this theory from Wallace, who was on the other side of the world, at the same time as you present your theory, and just put them side by side, which he duly did on the 1st of July 1858 at the Linnean Society. But actually was hardly noticed at the time. They were just presenting, it's in the minutes, but nobody took any notice of it. And in fact, Wallace wasn't there because he was on the other side of the world. In fact, Darwin wasn't there either because his 19-month-old son had just died 3 days previously, and so somebody else read them. But actually then Darwin did go on to publish his full book the following year. Now, Wallace actually started off thinking he was going to be a clergyman, as indeed Darwin did actually in the early days. But he turned to spiritualism, and when he got back to England, as he ultimately did, he sort of rather wrecked his reputation by defending in court cases and things a lot of spiritualist mediums who pretty clearly were fraudulent actually. At the time it was pretty clear as well, but Wallace threw in his lot with him. So it was partly that meant he didn't get the recognition perhaps that he deserved. And also, he wasn't from this sort of gentleman strata of society that the Royal Society and all those gentlemen scientists were from. He was a mechanic who went out and collected things for people. But maybe this year, as I say, it's an anniversary of his and of his death. I think probably getting a little bit more recognition for what he did. But the point I wanted to make really is that he certainly was not an arid reductionist. His ideas of evolution did not lead him to the same conclusions as they have led Richard Dawkins to, that this is the only meaningful explanation. He really thought there was something more to life than just the mechanics of what we see going on in science. And so he actually wrote this book, The World of Life, and you can see the subtitle. It's a manifestation of creative power, directed mind, and ultimate purpose. Some spiritual power outside of this material world itself. So clearly he, well, not just comfortable, he believed he threw himself in with that sort of idea. So he wasn't an arid mechanical reductionist either. Next person, Joseph Lister. Anybody remember what Lister did? It's a harder one. Yeah, that's right. It was he promoted the idea of sterile surgery, and this was I've got a picture of it there. The antiseptic carbolic spray was the thing that he invented. You read some awful stories of some of the doctors at the time who had been paediatricians and there'd been a fetus born dead, and they'd take the fetus, stick it in their pocket, literally, because they thought it was interesting to look at and see what had gone wrong. And then they'd go and they'd be ministering to other women and so on, and they'd just be covered in germs and stuff and the other things. So it's no wonder that there was a lot of disease around, because it was sometimes spread by the doctors. Well, Joseph Lister realised this necessity, and obviously it saved millions and millions and millions of lives as a result of that. So he was brought up as a Quaker, Joseph Lister was, in Glasgow, because that's what his parents were. But then he wanted to do training, and one of the few places he could go as a Quaker was the University of London. He wouldn't have been allowed to Cambridge or Oxford, for example. In fact, well, not at this time, but earlier, wouldn't have been allowed to go as a Catholic either, but certainly not as a Quaker. So after he married, he actually joined the Scottish Episcopal Church, because his wife had that faith, and he remained that through the rest of his life. So Lister was interesting because though he would discuss spiritual matters with his friends and his relations and his closest students, he got much more wary of doing that in public as he grew up. And I think this was a change in society that has been the case until quite recently, that certainly prominent people have been reluctant to talk about their faith through the 20th century. I think that is changing, actually. I think people are more willing to stand up and talk about their faith in the public place. That it's a reasonable thing to talk about. But certainly this part of the 20th century they didn't. So he became president of the Royal Society in 1895 to 1900. And as people did at the time, they asked him actually what his views were on religious matters. Now, Lister replied, but he said, you can't publish it till I've stopped being president of the Royal Society. So it wasn't actually published till 1909. But this is what he said. He said, I have no hesitation in saying that in my opinion there is no antagonism between the religion of Jesus Christ and any fact scientifically established. Okay, so he had a sort of orthodox faith. He didn't have a strong faith of himself that he wanted to go and evangelize people, but he was quite happy saying there's no antagonism between Christian religion and science. So this is now bringing us right into the beginning of the 20th century. Now the last three people are much more secular. And again, I think that probably that is partly a reflection of society, not so much anything intrinsic to science of itself. The first one was Ernest Rutherford, who of course split the atom, and he first did it just down the road here at the old Cavendish laboratory. As it happens, I know his great-granddaughter, Mary Rutherford Fowler, who's just been made Master of Darwin College. Actually, that could only happen in Cambridge, couldn't you? You appoint a woman and call them a master. But she's Master of Darwin College, just down the other end of this road here. And apparently when Ernest Rutherford was just a conventional cultural Christian at the time. So he used to close his lab on Sundays rigorously. He was an experimental scientist, and so, keeping experiments going takes a lot of effort, but he said nobody's coming to the lab on Sunday. He did that throughout his working life. And apparently he used to wander around the lab when things were going well, singing Onward Christian Soldiers. Things weren't going well, he'd sing Fight the Good Fight. And of course he was honoured, he was a Kiwi, so he was honoured by even more stamps in New Zealand. So he was a conventional Christian. At the time he went to church, he was quite happy with those things, so he didn't particularly espouse them in a strong way himself. But he saw no conflict between them, certainly, and he thought they were probably useful. Now, interesting, he was, of course, Sir Ernest Rutherford. He got knighted for his work. And this is a side thing, but it's a cautionary tale, really, that he died of a strangulated hernia when he was trying to chop down a tree in Newnham, where he lived. And when he first got ill, he was taken into Addenbrooke's Hospital, and of course they could perfectly well have operated on him, and it's not that dangerous if you operate on a strangulated hernia, because it's easy enough to do. But because he was a lord, the convention at the time was that you had to have somebody of equal rank to you to operate on you. And so they had to haul somebody in from London, who was probably a bit doddery, I suspect, and couldn't come until the next day, and that was too late. And Rutherford died because of that. So there are some disadvantages with privilege, actually. Where he worked, the old Cavendish, if you have time, this is a really nice thing to go and look at, again, just down the road. These are the main oak doors to the lab. His lab was just inside on the right, which actually they've refurbished recently, and they realised they had to get health and safety in and screen it off because there was so much mercury slopping around under the floorboards that it leaked. Above the doors there, it's got this written from Psalm 111:2, Magna opera Domini est quaesere in omnes voluntates eius, which you all know what it means. So now the interesting thing is that when the Cavendish moved from in town to the west of Cambridge, its modern concrete buildings, over the door there they put the same, this is remarkable really, in a modern translation, in Coverdale's translation, which you can't read, but I'll read it to you. It's the same verse. The works of the Lord are great, sought out of all them that have pleasure therein. I mean, right there up on the Cavendish laboratory, where the atom was split, it's pointing to the works of the Lord, God's works, and how much pleasure they give to those of us, how great it is to investigate them. The works of the Lord are great, sought out of all them that have pleasure therein. So that was Ernest Rutherford. The last two really didn't have any faith that I know of. Dorothy Hodgkin, anybody know what she did? X-ray crystallography, well done. And Nicholas Shapton. Now, Nicholas Shapton I did know because he was in my department here. Nicholas Shapton was the person that really explained the origin of climate changes by perturbations on a 100,000 and 400,000 year timescale of the orbits of the Earth around the Sun, which explain the periodic ice ages that have been experienced for the last 3 million years. Now, neither of them had particular faith, and I know Nicholas Chaplin didn't because I knew him. But interestingly, at Dorothy Hodgkin's memorial service, Max Perrott, who's a friend of hers, said, "Dorothy was more Christian in word and deed than many believers I have known. She radiated love." And she picked up strong Quaker values from her mother, and she had a strong passion for things like social justice, ethical issues, pacifism, that sort of thing. But no particular Christian faith, and neither was Nick Chaplin. And as I say, I think part of that might just be nothing intrinsic to science, but just the culture in which they were living, as you see this progression through the ages. So, of course, this is a sort of random choice of 10 people. But the interesting thing is that these people were chosen. I'm sure the Royal Society had not the faintest interest in their religious views, probably didn't know about them actually, but it's interesting just to look at them. These are people that have shaped our scientific world, and how many of them, their lives were shaped by their Christian beliefs. So half of them were religious in a conventional sense. Actually, Boyle, Newton, Franklin, Babbage and Lister, and most of those were actually, Lister wasn't, but the others, well, Lister and Franklin weren't particularly, but Boyle, Newton and Babbage, really it drove their whole lives, their Christian beliefs. Two of them were spiritual. They were quite happy with influence of forces outside of the material forces that they were studying in science, Jenner and Wallace. And the last three, Rutherford, Hodgkin and Chaplin, were secularists, although probably in line with their age that they lived in. Rutherford was quite happy, certainly, with religious things, as I said, and went to church conventionally. And Hodgkin was certainly sort of imbued with some of those values that you'd find in Christian faith. But more than half of them, well, 2/3 of them, saw the importance, or believed in the necessity, importance, the presence of spiritual forces outside the material. Now, how does that compare with the present day? Well, there's a lady in America that's called Elaine Eklund that's done some surveys recently of American scientists. This is not England, it's America. But I think she's doing one in England now. And she found that, interestingly, it's almost the exact same percentages. Half the people in America, certainly, were attending church or religious meetings regularly. Now, as I say, that might be different in England, this is America. 20% of them consider themselves to be spiritual, so they thought there was something more to life than just the material, but they didn't sort of engage with any organised religion. Again, that's partly characteristic, I think, of scientists, who are very independent sort of people. And then 30% were secularists, but actually almost all of those saw no conflict between science and religion. Most of them, I think, explained it by saying, well, they were brought up in a secular household, and that's why they were. They just sort of followed that. And very few of them actually saw a problem. So that sort of split, I mean, it might, I'm sure it's just accidental really, but the split from those 10 scientists the Royal Society chose and current beliefs is very similar actually, that half of them are profoundly religious and 2/3 of them quite actually believe in some spiritual forces outside of just the material that we study now. And then the last little thing I just want to point up really is that there was a survey by this chap Nuber in 1916, who tried to look at beliefs that people had. It was a pretty weird questionnaire, and some of the questions were pretty weird, but his conclusion in America was that 42% believed in a personal God. And this survey was repeated 80 years later in 1996, and it was published in Nature. And they came up with something like 40% believed in a personal God in 1996 when they did that. Which sort of fits with that other survey I just showed you. Although interestingly, when they looked at people in the most senior positions in the National Academy of Science, they came up then with smaller percentages of people that believed in God. As I say, it will be interesting to see what the picture is in Britain when Elaine Eklund gets to do that. But certainly, I know a lot of fellows of the Royal Society that are certainly Christian believers. And you heard one of them yesterday, John Polkinghorne. There's many others too. And I think probably people at large don't quite realise that, how big a part it is of people's lives. Partly, I suspect, because of media always likes to find things that are people that are in conflict, rather than things are fit together. It's not news that things work and things fit together. It's only news when things don't work and people are in conflict. So there's just a very eclectic sort of little survey of these 10 that were on the stamps. As I say, it was an encouragement to me just to see that these people, how important their faith was to their life. So John will give you a much more scholarly view of the interaction between science and faith through the last few centuries this afternoon, but there's the slide. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Bob. And we've got half an hour now for questions before coffee break, so over to you. Thank you.
I just got a question about Fellows of the Royal Society. Richard Dawkins claimed that he had done a survey of Fellows of the Royal Society and found that only about 2% of them believed in God. Can you comment on the reliability of Dawkins' sociological?
Yeah. You know, I can't remember now whether I got that survey or not. I suspect I got it and thought it was spam, so I just deleted it. And I suspect the people that did answer were his fellow travellers, but it's certainly more than 2%. I can name more than 2% right now. But it's of people who are profound believers, you know, actually go to church and actually say that it governs their life. It probably is a smaller percentage. I mean, actually, I think it's not dissimilar to the population at large. Actually, it might be slightly. I think it's probably slightly higher than the population at large. But you know, in Britain, that's not huge at the moment. If you go to one of the big city centre churches in Cambridge on a Sunday morning, interestingly, you'll find the students there overwhelmingly are scientists. Not at all what people would expect. You'd think it would be the humanities there, but 95% of the students there will be scientists, 5% humanities. I mean, I know it's something that worries the pastors and vicars there, actually. Why aren't they reaching the non-scientists? Somehow it's just easier to reach scientists because they have a belief that there is something true to be found, and they work at that. There's a truth behind what you see, and I think that's very coherent with Christian belief that you're looking for the truth behind this world we see. So, so there's far more scientists than humanities people in church, and I think probably compared to the population at large, that's true in Royal Society. Actually, that there's probably a bigger percentage of believers living in the world than in our society at large, but it's the same order, I think.
If there isn't an immediate question, oh, thank you, Bethany. If there isn't an immediate question, Bob, there's something you can add to Babbage, which I think is interesting. One of the essays of Hume during the Enlightenment caused a lot of trouble. It was his essay which argued that when you're dealing with somebody who reports a miraculous event, it is always more probable that the reporter of the miraculous event was deceived in some way than that the event took place as they reported. So it's a rather clever probability argument. Babbage actually used his computer and an account of the mathematics of Hume's argument to show that Hume was actually incorrect. You only need relatively few independent witnesses corroborating a particular event before the probabilities turn in favour of the supernatural involvement. So he is a very interesting figure because his science, his computer science, is actually transformed into an argument for contesting what was one of the most troublesome products of the Enlightenment.
Yeah, so that's fascinating. Thank you for that. Yeah. I know the statistics are funny things, aren't there? I think in a group this size, there's more than even probability that two of us have the same birthday. which is amazing, isn't it? Well, we could test it maybe, but it's not what you expect. In fact, you don't need this much. I think you only need 20 or so. You don't need 50. Yeah. So point out those statistics is important. Actually, we'll take a question in a minute, but I just think of statistics. A couple of my students are doing scientific work at the moment using Bayes' theory of probability, which is you have to put in what you think of as priors and then see what comes out the other end and see whether it's actually new information. But the Reverend Bayes, and this is used as scientific theory, I only realised a few years ago that the Reverend Bayes who put this forward actually didn't put it forward as a scientific mechanism. It's used by theologians to prove whether things are sensible or not, or whether God exists or doesn't. I never quite understood how that works, because it's really useful scientifically, but it was actually a theological theory to start with, actually, wasn't it? But
You've got to make the numbers up.
yeah, but it makes you realise what numbers you've made up, that's the whole thing of it. So at least you know what you put in as your prior assumptions. Oh, sorry, there's a question here.
Thanks. There seems to be a quite clear shift as you go through from these more earlier period of science through to the more current, is a shift that their background education would have involved a rigorous study of both classics and religious texts, because that's what society and education demanded at that days, moving to more modern sciences where early specialisation means that perhaps there's less background study in that. Do you think that's had an effect on how scientists have reflected on their faith in terms of just simply somewhat a lack of exposure?
Yeah, well, it may well have. Certainly the testimony from those 2,000 scientists that Elaine Eklund looked at, when she asked why they had sexual abuse, they said, well, that's what I was brought up with. You know, my parents were like that. So I'm sure there's truth in what you say. Of course, some of these people, 2 or 3 of them, went well beyond the conventional. Like Boyle was really certainly very devout, and others were as well. But what you brought up with, I think, does obviously impact what you know. I was talking to some of my students the other day, actually, at coffee, and these are doing PhDs, the creme de la creme, you know, cases doing PhDs. And I made some comment about going to the lion's den, which I thought was a fairly banal thing to do about something being given. They just looked at me. Why don't you go to a lion's den? And they'd never heard of that story, for instance, which we kind of take for granted as part of our cultural heritage. And I think we can't anymore, actually. Now, I'm not too worried by that, because actually it means, well, I'm a Christian, but from the point of view of Christian faith, then people aren't carrying that baggage, at least if you start with a clean slate, so there's some advantage to that, I think. But I'm sure you're right, that you know, the milieu in which you're brought up and what you know obviously affects the outcome.
I read somewhere, I can't recall the source, it goes back a bit. The First World War had a massive impact on people's views. A lot of people who suffered, and this was transmitted into their families. And is there any evidence that this is sort of the basis of which my parents didn't believe it? Because that might explain to some extent why it's trading off in the first half of the 20th century.
Yeah, well, I haven't heard that, but that particular thing, so I can't really comment on that hypothesis. But as Hilary said, I'm actually writing a book on where is God in natural disasters, and one of the interesting things, I mean, suffering is the big problem, isn't it, with the Christian faith? How can a God of love, who's sovereign over everything, allow suffering? That's the classic philosophical problem. But one of the interesting things I've come across is that often people that are suffering awful things, actually, it brings out a spirit of community and response, which wouldn't have happened otherwise. There's a book by Rebecca Solnit looking at the aftermath of some of the big disasters like the 1906 earthquake in San Francisco and Katrina and various other things. And she really talks about the fact, and actually we saw this even in the hurricanes on the east coast of the US that happened in November. People said there was a real sense of community after this. You know, suddenly we'd lost all our power and our freezers had gone off, and people coming out in the streets and getting their barbecues out and working as a community and sharing food and things, and they said it was really good. Now, it's a bit trite to say that, but nevertheless, you know, the communal experience of suffering can bring a sense of community and meaning and belonging, which wasn't there otherwise when you live in your little isolated boxes. So suffering is not always as negative as we think it might be. I mean, nobody would wish suffering on anybody, but sometimes there are good things that come out of it, I think. There's a lot more could be said about that, but so I don't know about the war. I know that sometimes there are people here who've been through the war, the last war, not the first war, last World War, not the First World War, there's lots of other wars. But I know some people come back from it feeling they're more alive during their war experience than when they come back afterwards. There's something vital that makes you put things in perspective at least and see what's important in life and what's not. Yeah. So I'm sure it's quite a complicated response to things like that.
Those are the ones who are chosen by the Royal Society that you happen to see religious belief in. Who would be the ones that weren't chosen by the Royal Society for stamps that you would hold up as people of real Christian faith?
Yeah,
Who would be your top kind of 5?
I don't know about 5, I'll tell you the one, of course, is Michael Faraday. That's why we named this after Faraday. He was a very devout Christian. I mean, he was an interesting man because it's not at all clear from his writings and so on. His scientific writings don't mention Christianity at all. As far as I can tell, there's very little mention of that. Not in the way that Babbage did or Newton did, put it in their textbooks, a whole section on it. But Faraday was a very humble and devout Christian. For instance, every afternoon he used to go out from his lab and distribute money to poor people in the East End of London. He belonged to a small sect called the Sandemayan sect, which has died out now. But I mean, I think probably Faraday is one of the greatest British scientists that have ever lived. Actually, I suspect more so than Newton and so on even. And he was certainly a lot nicer man than Newton was. He was a pretty unpleasant man actually. So Faraday was certainly hold up, and there's many others actually, and it'd be a bit invidious to pick out some of the others, but I'm quite happy to broadcast Faraday in this context.
Yeah. Bob, you talked about the influence of scientists' beliefs on religious beliefs. I've seen scientists doing so. Can you do it the other way around? I mean, is there people who are religious take up science? I mean, certainly I've noticed what you've noticed, that look at big churches, big cities, and they're full of people doing medicine and science and so on. Now, have they chosen to follow those careers because they feel this from their religious belief they want to do something useful rather than become a banker and make lots of money? I mean, are people's religious beliefs actually determining what they do? You think of physics. I mean, when people are very upset, strong religious beliefs about nuclear physics and atomic bombs and so on.
Yes. I think I don't know the answer. There's a really interesting study to be done there, actually, because I think the level of religious belief amongst biological scientists, is much lower at the moment than it is amongst physical scientists. And I don't know why that is, but there's something in there that's driving that, and we've got biologists here that might have views. Do you have views on that? Well, I'll come to you in a minute, but certainly some people used to go into what they call the caring professions for reasons like you said, to serve others. I mean, my own personal view, the reason I came to do physics, and the reason I'm doing geology now is that physics was too hard. and the geologists had, so I've got a great respect for John Polkinghorne and the like. The geologists went off on field trips and they camped and things were much more fun. Well, not much fun at the moment. Our first years are on Arran, and I've just heard that the Isle of Arran has lost all its power and they're stuck there for 3 but they were supposed to come back yesterday. So I'm sure they'll be having a great time now, I can sort of imagine actually. I don't know, do you have anything to say?
Sorry,
No,
I was going to ask that question actually. That was the question I was going to ask. Is there a bias in physics and order in the universe? You know, Einstein and Newton and all. And I was just wondering, do you have any statistics or physical scientists seem to have greater faith or more likely to be faith than biological scientists? And I was wondering where the biological science is more polluted by Darwin or something like that, whereas the physical sciences are. I was just wondering if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, as I said, I think it would be a really interesting research project to look into that polluted biological science. There are a lot of Christians at the time who said, "This is great. This is showing God's glory in a way that," as John was saying last night, to bring about what we see now, to bring about humans who are just a little lower than the angels, as it says in Psalm 8. I don't know, but as John said again, there is a certain beauty to mathematics, which is intrinsic to it somehow. There's some deep part of the cosmos that makes that a way that we can understand the cosmos, which biologists don't have. They're generally not that good at sums, I find. So I have this discussion with Dennis all the time. It's not here, is it?
Yeah, maybe because you're thinking in cosmology and the outer universe and all that. You think more outside the box, as a physicist. I don't know.
I don't know. Does Keith have views on it?
I mean, I agree with you.
Perhaps you just say your background, actually, so people know.
Yes, I'm a biochemist, and like Bob, I also came to Cambridge and intended to read physics and chemistry, and it was too hard, and I slipped even further. But the observation, I think, is correct that there are fewer Christians in the biological sciences than there are in the physical sciences, and partly I think it's because physics is more closely allied to philosophy. And actually asking questions about what is the nature of being, what is the nature of the universe. And I think biologists have been, maybe less so now, but more interested in just sort of data collection, taxonomy.
Stamp collecting, we used to.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm just talking. Rutherford called it stamp collection, actually. That's where the phrase came from.
So I think there's less of a tendency to think at that deeper level in biology. I think also the physics and the engineers are often out to change the world, and the medics also are out to change the world, and the biologists maybe don't have quite that same driving force. That's an overgeneralization.
Interesting. But it would be an interesting research project, wouldn't it? Actually, the reason I think you find so few humanities people, is that they've been polluted by postmodernism and all the whole idea that there's no ultimate truth to anything, it's only what you make of it. And I think that's a horrible way to live, actually. I think there is no absolute truth. And I think that's where scientists are a lot better off than some of the humanities people.
A comment rather than a question, Bob. One of my scientific heroes is Johann Kepler. My interest in introduction to science as a 10-year-old Peter, 9-year-old boy was reading an elementary book on astronomy. I ended up in biochemistry too. Not because I found it so easy, but because I found it more interesting. Kepler,
my father's a sergeant major, so I'll try and speak up on the playground. What struck me about Kepler is, it was Kepler who cried out as he discovered the laws of planetary motion, "Oh Lord, I'm thinking your thoughts after you." But if you read, and I've only read it in translation, not in original Latin, but his book on the mystery of the universe, he describes how for 5 years he
tried to find out the shape of the orbit of Mars. The great Danish astronomer Brahe had passed on to him his observations, and they didn't fit a circle, which Brahe thought they should. So he spent 5 years trying to find out which shape the orbit was. I point out to my PhD students that he had no calculating thing, and what kept him going for 5 years
it was his belief in two things. First of all, that there was a creator who had put, well, as he said, put geometry into the world, and that, I can't remember the exact quote, but he's taken Proverbs 8, about wisdom being with God, and he put the word geometry for the word wisdom. And the second reason he believed he would find the shape was he believed that God had put the same ideas into human minds. And there is Genesis 1, verses 26 to 28, made in the image of God. And for a kind of research student, it was that Christian belief, biblical belief, that kept him going for 5 years till he got the right answer. So if you're a PhD student and you're struggling, don't worry, keep at it.
Thank you. Since you talked about Kepler, let me just put up this quote from him. This is something he said: "I had the intention of becoming a theologian, but now I see how God is, by my endeavours, also glorified in astronomy. For the heavens declare the glory of God." It's the same thing as you're saying. Yeah. Actually, in the answer to some of that, let me just skip through to... These are various Christians over the ages that have contributed in a big way to science. So I've talked about some of them, there's others there too. Actually, I gave this talk in Japan, that's why it says Japanese at the top.
I was just wondering what that was all about.
Well, I've left it in there because it just makes the point that science is one of those great activities which is transcultural and transtemporal. So, you know, Newton's equation we still understand years later, but you can understand the same theory in Birmingham or Beijing. And I think actually science is one of the great unifiers in a world which is increasingly becoming fragmented and nationalistic. That's something we can hold on to and be pleased about, because Christianity also has that same perspective. You know. And many Christians have close links with people in Southern Africa or Asia or whatever, through mission or through aid. So I think, you know, the science and Christians have, those two groups of people have more possibility of bringing some peace to this world than almost any other group. So that's an encouragement. That's what all of us saying.
You mentioned the universality of science, and it's interesting to me that the science community, while you can be a dedicated physicist, you don't have to tear down the chemist or the biologist. You see them as looking at the world through a little bit different eyes, but as comrades. But you talk about the international nature of science. Why is it that when it comes to faith, we don't have that same generous attitude about people who look at the world through different eyes as we do in the science community?
That's a good question. I don't know the answer to that, because there's obviously things we can learn from each other. Absolutely. We should. But you can understand from the Christian perspective that other, you know, if Jesus says, "I am the way, the truth, and the life," there's no other way to God but me, that's pretty straightforward. But it doesn't mean you shouldn't be ungenerous to people that have different views, and you can learn from them and maybe share with them. You know, different religions have different truth claims, and they can't all be right if we believe in absolute truth. So you can understand why there should be discussion between different people of different belief systems, because they can't all be right. But nevertheless, we should be discussing them and talking about them and getting the commonality from them, for sure.
The different sciences have different truth claims also, depending on their perspective.
But none are inconsistent with one another, because if they were, then one of them would fall. There's an underlying unity to all of science. So it's a little bit different in that respect, I think.
Scientists can be ungenerous, Tom.
Oh, science can be incredibly ungenerous. That's a polite way of saying it. Yeah. Oh yeah, well they're not immune to that. That's human nature, sadly.
I wonder if I can ask you something. You talked about the humanities science divide maybe predicated on the rise of postmodernism and the loss of sort of absolutes. Well, I wonder if it works both ways, because certainly in the sort of theological world that I'm more familiar with, the transition from a more modernist view in the academy to a more postmodern one has meant that it's easier to study academic theology and have faith than it might have been, say, in the 80s, when there was a much more secular agenda in a lot of university institutions. theology departments. And I suppose that begs the question about, well, it leads me to ask the question of you, is what changes you've seen in, as your life as a research scientist over 30 years or whatever, and whether you see that it's easier now for perhaps your younger students to be people of faith and to be accepted. And I'm thinking also of the fact that probably in a research lab like yours, you're having many more students from other parts of the world where there is a strong faith tradition of whatever kind. And how does that differ over the past 20 years, 30 years?
I think there is more openness to religion in the public space. And people like Jonathan Sachs and so on have actually been, the chief rabbi, I think have been instrumental in that change actually, as well as many other people too. But actually, and as you say, I think it might come from postmodernism, from a sort of rather weak aspect of it, which says it's fine for you to believe that, I believe something, why doesn't everybody just believe what they want? Rather than being a nominal Christian country where there is one way and that's it. So the sort of multicultural and postmodernism aspects does actually, I think, make it a little bit easier to bring religion into the public space and discussion. But I am also extremely worried about John Pogner just coming in, I don't know if somebody wants to go to the door. I'm worried about the lack of tolerance that political correctness brings with it. When people stop believing in something, they don't just stop believing in that, they believe in anything. And part of the problem, I think, is the almost the witch hunts about people who do have strong views, so that's not allowable for politically correct reasons. And I do worry about that aspect of it. But as far as the openness of being able to be a person of faith, well, I'm fine with that. Now, there are people that pillory me for it, and that's part of the way it has to be. I think, at least I think, well, they've noticed I'm a Christian. So some of my colleagues are, they're very censorious about it. But, well, that's the way the world is, I think. But I'm sort of hopeful that we can have these discussions in public about the role of faith. And as I say, people like Jonathan Sachs have sort of helped that process of doing that. Where the world will be in another decade or so, I don't know. Anyone's guess.
Two, actually.
Hello. Just going back on the comment that someone made about wisdom translated as geometry in nature. The whole idea of fractals and shapes repeating themselves through nature, showing some kind of design, and people like Swedenborg. And are there people today that, as current scientists, that are studying that kind of thing? I'm just quite interested.
I don't know about fractals, because that's not an area I've ever known about. There are certainly people studying, I mean, this is slightly different from what you said, but it's interesting nonetheless, that people are studying the anthropic principle, which is the idea that it seems so exactly right for human life, that as Fred Hoyle said, who was president of the British Secular Society, he said it looks like a put-up job. And some of the constants, there's half a dozen constants which are extremely finely tuned, one part in 10 to the 20 different and we wouldn't be here. And that is a really deep philosophical question. Now, for Christians, you say, yes, I believe in a creator God and that's why it's like that. If you're not, then it's really hard to say, why should that be? Now, one answer is, well, we wouldn't be here if it wasn't like that, so it's a non-question. Another answer people have thought of, which is just a metaphysical answer really, is that there's a multiverse. There's an almost untold number, 10 to the 500 or some huge number, of other multiverses, of other universes, which we can't communicate with, we can't know anything about them, but this is the one that's just right for us, there's billions and billions that aren't. And it's interesting, that is a topic of academic engagement by secular scientists. So those two things, the multiverse and the anthropic principle, which is a topic of great secular research, it's interesting that that's the case. So those, I don't know about fractals, but those areas are certainly ones of big research, which are almost metaphysical questions, as Keith was saying, really. These are big metaphysical questions, and yet people are doing profound research on it, scientific research. And, you know, from my perspective as a Christian, then it seems pretty simple answer, yes. The world's the way it is because God intended it to be that way, but it's interesting that other people are studying that.
And we'll be hearing more about the anthropic principle after coffee.
From John, yes.
From John, yes.
Yeah. There was another question?
There was a question just behind you. I'll pass it back, thank you.
Professor White, how would you account for the fact that it seems that in the most prestigious academic circles, the number of theistic believers seems to be much more lower?
The number of
theistic believers. I know about Richard Dawkins' 2% figure, but I think in the American Academy for the Advancement of Science, I think the figure is about 7%.
It is true that National Academy of Science seems to have a lower percentage than the population at large. I suspect the Royal Society is the other way around. Just from people I know personally, there may be more Christian believers there than in the population at large. So I think it's an open question, actually. I think by and large it's fairly similar to the population at large, actually, the first order. And there's nothing, I think, that says you can't be a scientist and a Christian, as I've talked about. So. But we certainly need a bit more research, and I think Elaine Eklund is doing some in-depth research on British scientists at the moment. I mean, it would be nice to find proper statistics and see, because that survey is just not a very reliable one, I'd say, charitably, from Richard Dawkins.
We've got time for another couple of questions. Are there any more? It's Mary's got one.
In terms of scientists speaking out about their faith, once you get to be a senior scientist, you can say more or less what you like. If you're a junior scientist, do you think there is a pressure on junior scientists to keep quiet about their beliefs because it might affect their scientific career?
Well, I have no evidence of that. So, I mean, interestingly, in my research group, I've often had one Christian and the other 6 aren't. I can't see any discernible difference in their careers, actually. No, I was going to say that Christians often bring other things into their life of, you know, probity and honesty and integrity. That's true of other people as well. So I can't say I have seen any particular. Maybe you have, but I don't think I have seen any particular difference in treatment of people, whether they're Christians or not. I mean, one point is that many people don't know whether they're Christians or not, actually. I mean, if you sit in your lab or your school or your workplace, do you know how many other Christians are there? Actually, I think that's one of the indictments of our society. We're so atomistic, individualistic, that we often don't know. And interestingly, we started a lunch in my department for students and staff who were Christian, just to meet together once a term, so that we actually recognised each other, because it's just an encouragement to see each other around the workplace. And you know, we knew 3 or 4 people, and they invited their friends, and now there's a list of 40 in my department here, that we don't all meet together, but we're all invited each time. And it really surprised me. There's lots of people I didn't know that. And I think that's one of the problems with our culture, that actually we don't know what other people, we don't know much about their lives, actually. And I think it's a sadness that we don't, actually, because we are relational people. You know, we're built for relationships with other people, and often we don't have those. So I've sort of strayed off your questions here sometimes, but I've never seen negative discrimination against people here, at least in my experience. But I don't know if somebody. Well, Dennis Alexander will tell you he had somebody working in his lab who was an intelligent design believer, and he wouldn't be, but he worked in his lab. You know, the actual experiment you're doing doesn't depend on your beliefs, really.
The reason I asked the question is because I think in Elaine Eklund's book, she actually says that in the American system, quite a few people are unwilling to speak out because they feel that will affect their career. I'm just curious whether there's any evidence in answer.
Yes. Well, I think America is another planet, isn't it? I can say that because my son is American, born in America. Because of Christian.
One more quick question, and then we'll break for coffee.
So, being a Cambridge one yourself, I wonder, have you got any thoughts that you want to share on the whole Churchill College debacle with Crick and him resigning his fellowship because he believed as a scientific college it should be based on secular and not that there should be a chapel at Churchill? Have you got any thoughts to share on that and what that might reflect about today's views?
I've never really thought about it. I mean, Churchill has got a chapel actually, and it's just up the road. They just built it at the edge of the chapel. They bought a bit of land just beyond the Churchill grounds and built it there. So there is a chapel. It's not on Churchill ground, but it's Churchill Chapel. There's always one of the interesting things about the debate with people like Crick and Richard Dawkins and so on is that they have very loud voices, and you hear a lot of them, and there's a big mass of quieter people that are quietly getting on with their lives in a different way. And the media, I work a lot in climate change issues, and the media is always the same. If they got somebody to talk about climate change, they'll have somebody also a climate change skeptic. And if you're just casually listening, you think, well, they're sort of equally balanced. There's as many on that side as that side, because that's what you always hear on the Today programme or the 6 o'clock news or whatever. And the real world out there isn't like that. And I think Crick is in a minority actually in that respect. So I don't think there's anything profound to be drawn from it other than our culture that we live in likes to find two opposing sides always through the media. And I think that's something that probably is worth addressing to try and get more sanity into the debate. And that's partly what we're trying to do at the Faraday Institute. It was set up by Dennis and myself, who are both working scientists. He's a biological scientist, I'm a physical scientist, and we just wanted to say, look, you can be a scientist and a Christian or a person of faith, and let's just discuss that. There's nothing weird about it. And we set it up not in a divinity department, there are other places like this set up in a theology department, and then everybody says, well, you would think that, wouldn't you, because you're in divinity or theology. So that's why we purposely didn't set it up in a theology department.
Thanks very much, Bob.
Do you want to say a last word?
Yes, it's just a last word on the Crick question, as a matter of fact, because there is now a history of that episode, written from within the college. I think a college chaplain here at Churchill, somebody well versed in the history of the whole thing. And a very nice point is made at the end. The irony that despite the fracas and Crick's protest, two of the most distinguished scientists in Churchill at the time, who became or already were Nobel laureates, regularly went to church. So if you're wanting to pick Crick out as in any way typical, you've got the contrary evidence too.
And on that note, I think we'll break the coffee, but first let's say thank you to Bob for a very stimulating